All right, listeners, ready for a deep dive into a pretty wild plan. It's about tackling climate change.
Sounds intriguing.
It is, it really is. Picture this. The UK, they're racing towards those net zero goals, right? And they might completely change how they pay for carbon capture and storage.
Big changes on the horizon.
Yeah, potentially huge. We're talking maybe even $27 billion. A real gamble.
Wow, $27 billion. That's a serious chunk of change.
It is. So are they brilliant or crazy? Well, that's what we're going to find out today.
I'm ready to dive in.
Awesome. So glad to have you here. You know, the UK's commitment to hitting net zero by 2050 is no joke.
Right. They're really banking on CCS to get there.
CCS, carbon capture and storage.
Yeah.
Basically sucking that CO2 right out of the air and stashing it underground. Sounds simple, right?
In theory, maybe, but it's not exactly cheap.
Not cheap at all. And that's the problem. Scaling up CCS to the level they need, we're talking a truly massive investment.
It's going to take a lot of cash.
Yeah.
To hit their goals, the UK wants to capture and store 50 megatons of CO2 every single year by the mid-2030s.
50 megatons. To put that into perspective, that's like turning off every single power station in the UK. Poof. Gone. No more emissions.
A powerful image, for sure. And achieving that requires some serious funding. Right now, a lot of that's coming from the government. But to make this thing really sustainable, they've got to attract private investment.
Okay, so that's where this $27 billion gamble comes in. Trying to get investors excited about CCS.
Exactly. Right now, they're leaning heavily on the UK emissions trading scheme. It's basically a carbon market. Companies that pollute got to buy allowances for their emissions.
Right, so the idea is it makes it financially painful to pollute.
Exactly. It encourages them to clean up their act. But here's the thing. Will this alone be enough to pull in those big investments for CCS? There are some doubts.
Yeah, I mean, burying CO2 underground, it's not exactly the most glamorous investment out there.
It's a tough sell. You're dealing with a relatively new technology, not a lot of proven results, technical challenges, uncertainties about long-term storage. Investors get a little nervous.
So then comes this bold new idea, the Carbon Takeback Obligation, or CTBO for short.
CTBO. I like it.
Catchy, right? Now, this is where things get interesting. It's a total shift in how we think about who's responsible for emissions.
It really flips the script.
Yeah.
Instead of just paying for emissions, the CTBO would make fossil fuel producers, those oil and gas giants, actually capture and store a certain amount of the CO2 they create.
So it's like, hey, you dug it up. You deal with it. No more passing the buck.
Precisely. And the really cool part is, this could actually create a self-sustaining market for carbon storage. Imagine this. Oil and gas companies under this obligation, they're suddenly scrambling to figure out how to capture and store all this CO2.
They'd have to get creative.
They'd have no choice. And that could lead to a burst of innovation, pushing CCS technology forward way faster.
Makes sense. If they need it to operate, they'll find a way to make it work.
Exactly. And as the CCS market grows and gets more efficient, it could eventually ease the burden on taxpayers. Maybe even a win-win.
Maybe a win-win. The people who wrote the report seem to think so. They're cautiously optimistic about CTBO really kickstarting the CCS industry.
They do. But they also say any plan has to be super carefully thought out to avoid any unintended consequences.
Because let's be real, a change this big, there's going to be pushback. What are we talking about here? What are the potential downsides?
Well, one big concern is how it would affect UK companies competing globally. If their costs go up because they have to capture and store all the CO2, they might struggle against companies in countries without those same rules.
Oh, yeah, the classic economic competitiveness issue. Makes sense. What else?
Another valid concern is the effect on energy security and prices. What it would mean for you and me every day costs heating our homes, filling up our cars. Even the price of groceries could go up if fossil fuels become more expensive.
Ouch, yeah. Nobody wants to see their bills go through the roof. That's a big one.
It is. And then there's the risk of carbon leakage. What if instead of reducing emissions, we just end up shifting them to other countries with weaker environmental rules? If the UK goes it alone on this, it might not have the global impact we're hoping for.
So it's not just about slapping a mandate on the fossil fuel industry and calling it a day. There's a whole web of things to think about. What are the experts quoted in the articles saying about all this? Do they like this radical idea?
Well, the report quotes Professor Miles Allen from Oxford. He's a big name in the net zero movement.
Right, I've heard of him.
He says the fossil fuel industry, they have the money to pull this off.
They certainly do.
They've made huge profits from fossil fuels for decades. So now it's their turn to step up and provide the storage we need. He sees this as a practical way to get to net zero.
Like a cosmic balancing of the scales.
Yeah.
They took the carbon out, now they got to put it back. Interesting concept.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing not everyone agrees.
Yeah, you're right. Professor Stuart Hazeldine from the University of Edinburgh, he wasn't part of the report, but he makes a good point about the timeline.
Okay, what's he saying?
Well, he says commercial carbon storage, it's happening, but it needs to scale fast, like 100 times faster if we want to hit those net zero targets.
Wow, 100 times faster. That's pretty ambitious.
It is. He even suggests making the price of fossil fuels include the cost of storing the CO2.
So some say make it their responsibility, others say just bake it into the cost of doing business. Either way, there's a real sense of urgency.
Definitely. And that brings up a big question. Is it even fair to put all of this on the fossil fuel companies?
Tough question. On one hand, they've made a ton of money from the stuff that's causing climate change. Hard to say they don't have a responsibility to help fix it.
Right.
But then there's the potential impact on jobs and costs. We need to make this transition fair for the people who work in those industries.
It's a complex issue for sure. Lots of ethical and economic factors to consider. And this isn't just a UK thing either. This report's about Britain, but could this carbon takeback obligation idea work in other places?
That's a great question. Imagine if the UK actually did this. It could have huge ripple effects on the global energy market. Other countries might feel pressure to follow suit.
It's possible. But we have to remember there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Every country's got its own unique situation, different energy sources, different political and economic realities.
True context is everything. But even if it's not a universal solution, the basic idea is pretty revolutionary, right? Making the people who produce fossil fuels responsible for dealing with the CO2 emissions.
Yeah, it really challenges that old way of thinking where companies take what they want and leave the environmental mess for everyone else to clean up.
Exactly. It makes us think differently about the real cost of our energy choices. Pretty powerful stuff. But let's bring it down to earth for a second. For the average person listening, someone who's not a climate policy expert, what would all this actually mean?
That's the important question, isn't it? At the end of the day, this isn't just about some abstract climate goals. It's about our everyday lives, our wallets, our jobs.
It's about real people.
It is. And as we talked about, there's the issue of energy prices. If this makes fossil fuels more expensive, we'll all feel it. Heating bills, gas prices, even the cost of groceries could go up.
So those big policy debates can have a real impact on families trying to make ends meet. Kind of scary when you think about it.
It can be. And we can't forget about jobs either. The shift to cleaner energy will definitely create new opportunities, but we have to make sure it's fair for the people working in the fossil fuel industry right now. We need policies that help them transition to new jobs.
Right. Finding that balance, moving towards a greener future, but not leaving people behind in the process. It's tricky.
Yeah.
But even with all these challenges, this carbon take-back obligation idea, it feels like it could really change things.
I think so too. It's a bold move that could really boost CCS development. Maybe even reduce how much we rely on government funding. It might even inspire other countries to try something similar.
It could start a whole new trend.
Maybe. But with any big policy shift, there are always trade-offs. We have to weigh the potential benefits against the potential risks very carefully.
Right. We can't just jump in without thinking about the downsides.
Yeah.
And we need to make sure whatever we do, it works for everyone.
Exactly. That's where good policy design comes in.
Yeah.
And open public discussion.
Yeah.
We need to make sure these policies are implemented fairly and that they truly benefit everyone.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from the urgent need for CCS to this radical new idea and all the complicated stuff in between.
We have, but I think it highlights how important it is to look at climate change from different angles.
Right.
It's not just an environmental issue. It's tied to the economy, social justice, even global politics. It's all connected.
Yeah, it really shows how climate action is connected to everything else, economics, social justice, even global politics. It's a lot to think about.
It is. It's complicated. And that's what I find so interesting about this report. It's not just about pointing fingers or throwing money at the problem. It's actually trying to find ways to encourage developing important technologies like CCS while also taking into account all those bigger societal impacts. It's looking at the whole picture, not just one piece.
So for our listener out there who maybe isn't a climate expert but wants to understand all this, what's the main takeaway? What should they remember from all of this?
I think the big takeaway is this. There's no easy answer, no quick fix for climate change. This carbon takeback obligation, it's just one piece of a very big, very complex puzzle. It has a lot of potential, but it also has some risks that we need to think about carefully.
Right, it's not a perfect solution, but it could really shake things up. Maybe it could even be a turning point.
Maybe. So what should people be looking out for as this story develops? What are the big questions, the things to keep an eye on?
Good question.
Well, one thing to watch is how policymakers react to this report. Will they go for it? Will they try to change it? And how will the fossil fuel industry respond? Will they fight it? Or could this actually push them to become leaders in CCS? And then, of course, there's the public. What will people think about this idea? Will they support it? Or will there be a backlash?
It's kind of a big social experiment playing out in front of us.
It is. And it makes you wonder if this could be a shift away from just making polluters pay to something more proactive, more about taking responsibility and finding solutions together. And this isn't just a UK thing either. This has implications for the whole world.
Absolutely. If the UK goes ahead with something like CTBO, other countries might follow their lead. It could speed up climate action around the globe. Or it could start a whole new set of arguments. It's a story that's just getting started.
It is. It's fascinating to think about.
It really is. So as we wrap things up for our listener today, we've given them a lot to consider. What's the one thing we want them to walk away thinking about?
Well, the report focuses on the UK, but the questions it raises are relevant everywhere. How do we balance climate action with economic reality? How do we make sure the transition to cleaner energy is fair for everyone? And how do we hold the people responsible for emissions accountable in a way that actually creates change? These are questions every country in the world is facing.
Powerful stuff. This has been a great deep dive, and we've given our listener a lot to think about. Thanks for joining us today. And as always, we encourage you to check out the sources we've linked. Read them for yourself, form your own opinions. This is a conversation we all need to be a part of. Until next time, stay curious and keep asking those tough questions.